Hi, Despot Antrim here. So I'm going to do a quick review of a novel I read recently called The Midnight Library. It's written by Matt Haig, an author. I've never read anything by him before. That was the first book I've read from him. And I would say this book is good, but not great. It has a pretty good message, which I'll get to at the end. And it's in the grass is always greener in the other parallel universe genre. So basically, I would just about recommend the book to someone who's interested in the whole parallel universe genres. There's better books, much better books in that genre, but it's still pretty good and I would recommend it. So there's my review, and I am going to give my thoughts on it. First of all, just addressing the grass is always greener in the other parallel universe genre. If you want to read a book in that genre that's much better than this, Recursion by Blake Crouch or Dark Matter by the same author, they're excellent, particularly Recursion. They're both really good, and they do things with the possibilities of the parallel universe narrative that are really great, really funny, dramatic. It creates these peaks in the book, and you don't really get that with the Midnight Library. The main problem I had with this book is that despite the fact that you could do a lot of fun things and a lot of really interesting, cool things with the whole entering parallel universes, parallel lives, it's not particularly interesting or particularly good at any point in the novel. It's very flat. So basically, I'll do a quick summary. So the main character is called Nora Seed, and she has depression, and she has a really shit day, and she decides to swallow a mouthful of pills. So just before she dies, she enters this place called the Midnight Library, which is between life and death. And in this library, she can access an infinite amount of books, all of which contain a different life, which resulted from a different choice that she made in her past. So she can literally she can enter an infinite number of lives that are parallel, that are occurring at the same time as her own life. So an infinity of Nora seeds to choose from. All right, so that's the premise and a summary of the plot. So the problem that the narrative develops is what I call the imposter problem. Every single time she enters one of these parallel lives, she's an imposter in it. She doesn't enter it with the knowledge of the parallel Nora's experiences and life and memories and talents and skills. She just enters it with her own set of those things. So she's literally just the original Nora inhabiting the universe of the Nora in the parallel life. And that's not really experiencing a parallel life at all. You're always an imposter. And I think that what the author should have done was, yes, Nora would be aware of the Midnight Library. She'd be aware that if she doesn't like this life, she can leave it and return to the library if she is genuinely disappointed in it. But at the same time, she would enter it, and for inexplicable reasons related to quantum mechanics or metaphysics or whatever, she just is aware of this previous life in the parallel universe. She's aware of all these skills and talents and experiences that she has in addition to her own. And for example, she enters a parallel universe where she's a rock star, parallel life where she's a rock star, and in that she's on stage and she doesn't know any of the songs. Okay, that's a problem. Really, this demonstrates the imposter problem. She can't then experience that life properly. So she would enter that. The way I would have done it is she enters that and she does know the songs. She doesn't know how she knows them, but she does know them. And maybe she's not fully integrated into the life, but as time moves on, the memories of that parallel life begin to show up in her brain, which that was the only aspect of it that the author included. The longer Nora stayed in the parallel life, the more memories would come into your brain. But basically, she was always an imposter, so she could never fully integrate into these lives. And I think she could never really be satisfied anyway. And that was the problem I had with the book. She could never really experience these parallel lives from the perspective of the parallel Nora. She was always the source, the original Nora. Okay. And that was a main problem that I think held the narrative back. So one thing I really like about this book, though, is that it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's not long. It's an appropriate length. It's not too short, not too long. And when she is starting to live more and more and more parallel lives, she lives a parallel life, she gets bored, she goes back to the library, lives another one, lives another one, lives another one. they get increasingly shorter until the author just starts summarizing the lives that she's lived before she enters one that she really likes. And that's good because that means that the book's not too long and it's not too repetitive and it doesn't get too boring. The author is really good at just moving the narrative along. So I have to give him a lot of credit for that, because this is a book that could easily have become overindulgent, and it isn't. One of the problems this book has is that it doesn't have any great characters. The main character, Nora, she is a good character. She feels like a real person, but it's a boring real person. It's a woman who has a fairly typical, view of the world and has had a fairly typical life. She's an underachiever. She's a bit depressed. She spends maybe a wee bit too much time on social media. She hasn't got much going on in her life. If anything, she's probably even a wee bit below average in terms of where she's at in life compared to most people. But nothing special going on. And I think that's kind of the point, but that doesn't mean she has to be a boring person or a boring character, which she absolutely is. She's a very boring person. There's nothing interesting about her personality or her way of thinking or her worldview. And that is a bit of a problem. And there are no good characters around her. They're not cookie cutter. They're not two-dimensional. I mean, a couple of them are here and there. For example, her manager in the rock star lifestyle is a cookie cutter. And her actor boyfriend is again kind of cookie cutter, but that was the closest the book came to humor. But no great characters. There was one that I did like. There was one, and this was one of my favorite scenes in the book. It's one of the first parallel labs she enters. It is this guy she used to go with who she was going to marry. And Nora thinks, what would have happened if I'd married that guy? So she goes into that life. And as it turns out, their dream of owning a pub together in the countryside was shite, because they were heavily in debt. The bank were after them for their money. Her husband, Nora's husband, turned into a drunk. He was fucking another girl, at least one that she knew about. And he very quickly leaves that life after a few hours of realizing, wow, this is actually shite. And that's a really good demonstration of the grass is always greener thing. You sort of think, oh, what if I'd open up a pub in the countryside? It presents the reader with the realities of, well, you'd have to manage a pub, you'd be in debt, you'd have a big fat loan to pay off, and you'd be kind of bored living in the countryside and having to deal with this person who you're supposed to love, but now you're working together, you're constantly together, and you're getting bored of each other. So I thought that was nice. That was it takes this starry-eyed dream and just smashes it in the head with a sledgehammer. That was really good. I really liked that part of the book. And Nora's husband, that character, he's quite good. He's a very good character because he's such a dickhead. He's such an absolute dickhead, but he's a dickhead in a way that is kind of effortless. He's effortlessly horrible. He just kind of doesn't give a shit about much, and he's lazy, and he takes things for granted, and he fucked another woman, not because he got bored of her, but just because he could, and he got lucky one night. He's such a lazy loser, and that's why you hate him so much. He's a really good character, but he doesn't show up much in the novel. He shows up again trying to break into your house, which is kind of funny. But he's one of the better characters in the novel, but that's about the height of it. The rest of the characters are quite flat, dull, and boring, in my opinion. The another problem with the book is that it doesn't really have any peaks. I think I just described to you the best part of it, that where she goes to the pub and it's not great. The other parallel lives that she lives, where, for example, she's a rock star. Well, what happens? She goes on stage, plays Bridge Over Troubled Water in front of a big crowd, and it's amazing. And people tell her, that was fucking rock and roll, man. And it's just a bunch of cliches. And then she does an interview and she has a phone call, and that's about it. Like, pretty boring stuff. If I was writing a novel about parallel universes and one of them was a rock star, I'd have maybe the main character addicted to drugs or something. She looks at her arm and it's got heroin scars all over it, and she feels like withdrawal symptoms from heroin, and she wants to go back to the library, but she can't until she gets a hit. Like that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff, that'd be pretty cool. But instead, it's very flat, very dull and safe, and not particularly inventive most of the time. And some of them are downright boring. Like, she goes into a life where she's a scientist in the North Pole, and it's just boring mostly. Another problem with the book is that there's just not much humor there. Like I said, if you read those Blake Crouch books, Crouch Books, sounded like Gollum there for a second, you'll see really funny things he does with the parallel universe genre. He uses those possibilities to present funny situations. And it's kind of a dark humor, but it's still there, and it is really funny, and it has these brilliant peaks. But this book doesn't. It's kind of flat, and there's not much humor there when there really could have been. And the book has quite a low, depressing tone the vast majority of the time. There's a very optimistic tone at the end, but it didn't need to be so flat and depressing the rest of the time. You know, every single life is unsatisfying kind of thing. Yeah, a bit depressing. And I know that's kind of the point the author was getting at, but still, it wasn't necessary to be that dull and humorless all the time. It is kind of bleak, and for a parallel universe novel, it is surprisingly dull. Like I said, she's a rock star. Not a particularly fun story there in that little parallel life. Another one, Nora is an Olympic swimmer. She just spends the entire time in a hotel. She's a retired Olympic swimmer. She spends the entire time in a hotel and then gives a speech. The speech was kind of good. You know, it was sort of an anarcho, couldn't give a fuck anymore speech. It was pretty good, but again, a bit dull. You could have done a lot more with it. I did quite like the ending. I thought the ending was good. Basically, the ending was pointing out the fact that ultimately what matters most in life is your attitude toward the future and your attitude toward yourself, and gratitude, being grateful for what you have, and also grateful that you are not a lot worse off, and working toward building a better future for yourself. That's a really great message, and it's one that more people should be aware of, because if they did have that attitude, they'd do a lot more with their life. If there were less people who were depressed about the fact that they're 37 years old and haven't done much with their life, it's like, well, you know, you're not 77. You can still do a lot with your life. Just move on and be optimistic and try. That's a really great attitude, and that's kind of the message at the end of the book, which I really liked. Now, it's taken me a while to review this book, and one of the reasons for that is because I couldn't really think of a particularly good reason to do it, other than it's good and it's not particularly bad in any places. It gets through the whole story pretty quickly, and it's ultimately quite a decent, fun enough read with some scenes that are pretty good. Actually, come to think of it, I'm not sure I would even recommend it. Anyway, but nothing stood out. Like I read novels, I read books, and I can think back to parts of them that really stuck out as very vivid, interesting, dramatic, funny. For this one, very little sticks out. It's just such a flat read. Yeah, I mean, it's when I say flat, I don't mean flat as in it hits a low baseline. It's pretty bad, and it just remains bad the whole time. It's good, and it remains good the whole time, but it's never great. You know, nothing really sticks out. So yeah, if it was any longer, I think this book's about 6-7 hours long. If it was any longer, I definitely wouldn't recommend it, because it is short and it's somewhat interesting, and it does carry a good message, and there is some fun in there. I'd say, yeah, just about read it if you're interested in the parallel universe genre. But if you don't read it, you're honestly not missing out on much. Credit to the author though, because it could have been a lot worse, and it's a competently done book, and it's well written enough, and I did finish the whole thing, and I did enjoy it. I just didn't love it, and I would certainly not evangelize for it, but very decent. And yeah, credit to the author. Good book, and meh. Yeah. Thanks for listening.